I'm Ned Barnes with the Palm Beach Civic Association. I'd like to welcome you to our walking tour of Royal Poinciana Way. The goal of this event is to better understand the PUD-5 so that all of us can make intelligent decisions when we go to the polls on Tuesday, and I hope you all go to the polls. We have our expert, our town councilman Michael Pasillo, with us today to guide us in our walking tour. We also have Jane Day, who is a landmark expert, but Jane has been held up, and she'll be here. She's going to join us, the tour in progress. I'd like to invite all of you, if you're still confused after this, to come to the Civic Association annual meeting next Monday at the Flagler Museum at 10 o'clock. We've invited Michael Ainsley, who's standing right here, to speak in favor of the PUD-5, and Susan Markin will speak in opposition for 5 minutes each. And now, without any further ado, I'll turn it over to our leader, Michael Pasillo. Mr. Pasillo, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ned. I want to thank the Civic Association for organizing this, and I want to thank all of you for coming out on this beautiful Palm Beach day, and welcome. As I go through this, I've done this a few times now, so I'm starting to get pretty good at it, and I think we'll try and get you in and out of here in an hour, touch on the highlights. If you've got questions, ask me those questions as we're walking from property to property. If you've got questions, that's probably a good time. And then I can repeat the question when we stop at our next stop. I spoke to Jane Day earlier this morning, and she unfortunately had something at her house that slowed her down, so she's going to be a little bit late today, but she will be joining us. And Jane is invaluable because she's got the experience about the architecture and the history of some of the buildings that we're going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about it, the PUD-5, primarily from the perspective of zoning, comparing existing CTS zoning with the potential PUD-5 option. So Jane will sort of supplement what I've got to say by talking about some of the history and the architecture of some of the buildings that are important. One rule we've established: if a big truck goes by, I just stop talking. Let me start by start with the contributing building report. It hasn't received much press, but an integral part of the PUD-5 is the contributing building report which Jane Day prepared. Jane cataloged every single property on this 5-acre block that constitutes the potential PUD-5 option. That's from the north side here of Royal Poinciana Way to Sunset, bounded by County Road at Bradley Place on the east and west. It's a 5-acre area. This is the only area that the PUD-5 applies to. Jane's gone through and looked at the history, the architecture of each of these buildings, and categorized them into 4 separate categories of buildings. They are architecturally and historically contributing, and I'll point out some of those. Architecturally contributing. The third one is the most difficult, really, I think, to understand, and that's the urbanistically contributing. That was a term that was coined by our design guidelines fellow Steve Mouzon, and those are buildings that have certain characteristics that are worth preserving, but not necessarily the entire building, and it changes with each building. The first 2 categories, historically and architecturally contributing, are buildings that cannot be torn down under the PUD-5. That's very important. These are buildings that cannot be torn down if you develop under the PUD-5, and there's 11 of them on the block. There's 7 others that come into the category of urbanistically contributing, where portions of them have to be either preserved or renovated in the context of any PUD-5. The 4th category is the non-contributing, and it wouldn't surprise you to know we're standing on a non-contributing property right now. This is a property that can be torn down, and we actually would hope will be, and have something much finer put in its place. So those are the 4 categories, and I tell you about those now because as I walk through, I'm going to be saying, all right, this building fits this category, and that means this is what you can do with it under PUD-5, this is what you can't. Words about the CTS zoning. CTS zoning, which is the current zoning here, and it will stay in place. PUD-5 is simply an option. The CTS zoning that was enacted in 1980, most of the properties on this block, in fact all except for one, which I'll point out, predate the enactment of CTS zoning in 1980. CTS zoning is pretty parking intensive. It requires 1 parking space for every 200 square feet of retail, 1 parking space for every 250 square feet of commercial space. So you get the picture right away that if you saw the street developed under CTS, it would be fairly parking intensive. And that's a factor that I'll talk about as we go through. Let's talk a little bit about the property we're standing on right now, and then I'm going to move to the east side of the block, and we can talk about some properties there. This property, owned by the Testas, this gas station, is non-contributing. It can be torn down. It's one of only 2 properties on the street where you can, because it's totally non-contributing, you can have a 3rd story. And talk a little bit about height and stories at this point. You could have a 3rd story. What the PUD provides for is 70% lot coverage on the 1st floor and the 2nd floor, which is the same as CTS zoning, and a 3rd story on 2 properties here in the bank building, which we'll talk about when we get to, but limits you to 35% lot coverage. So essentially a half of the size on the 3rd story. CTS allows for 1 story as of right, 2 stories by special exception, and 3 stories by variance. And the lot coverages are 70% all the way. So you could see 3 stories on, at least a small 3rd story on this portion. At this point, I think what I'd like to do is, unless there are any questions, we can move to the east. I'm going to go and look at some of the building on the corner, which is actually under 1 ownership, but it's several buildings. The bookstore, Nick and Johnny's, and then the John Vogt Art Deco wraparound that's at the very end of the block. Those are all contributing buildings that can't be torn down. Let's go down there and take a look, and if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer. Oh, right here.
Sorry, I'm home. Michael, I just wondered, how many of these contributing buildings could be considered for landmarking?
Good question. The question was how many of these contributing buildings could be considered for landmarking. I may let Jane Day amplify on my answer because she's been through that process and I haven't, but my understanding is that she's looked at all of these and determined that they really don't meet the criteria for landmarking under our town ordinance. There's 1 or 2 that possibly could be, and there's a few of them I think that might make it, but generally the view has been that these buildings are not buildings that could be landmarked under our existing town ordinance. In fact, I should say the only property in this entire 5-acre area that is landmarked is the Bradley House, and that's on the corner of Sunset and Bradley Place. And by the way, that's 4 stories. Question back there in the glasses.
You mentioned the categorizations historically significant. Are there examples where there have been buildings on the island that have that designation but have also been torn down?
No. The question was, has that designation been applied to other buildings and they've been torn down? This designation is these designations are something that are unique to the PUD-5 and to the contributing building report. Nowhere else in our town code would this exist. And the reason it exists here is in our town generally under our code we have landmarks and essentially non-landmarks. We've got about 280 landmark properties in the town and the rest is not. Because these properties don't necessarily fit, there is a recognition at the outset that this block has historic significance as a main street. It may not have great architectural significance. For example, the building next door, Testas, developed in 1947. Draper Babcock was the architect, not one of the great well-known architects in town, but the whole block has great historic significance. So we felt we had to come up with separate categories specifically for the PUD-5 that would ensure if you develop under the PUD-5, and there are incentives to development, parking being a significant one, that you would preserve these buildings voluntarily, not through the landmark process. Right. Oh, hey, Jane's here.
I'm here.
Jane, we had a question about whether, before you got here, whether everything on this block could be landmarked or whether these architecturally, historically contributing buildings could be landmarked. You've been through that process in greater detail than I have, and maybe you could just supplement what I said, which was probably not for most of them.
Good morning. My name is Jane Day. I was lucky enough to be the landmark preservation consultant for 20 years with the town. I've looked at this street for that entire 20 years, and one of the things that's interesting about it is, although that our landmarks ordinance does not require owner consent, that for the last 20 years, The town council and people on landmarks have tried to work with owners so that they would voluntarily landmark their houses, come to consensus rather than being contentious about things. I believe that there are some buildings on this street that might qualify for landmarking on their own. They would require further study to make that determination in the regular landmark process. Those buildings are the buildings that the PUD-5 has identified as historically and architecturally contributing buildings to the block. Another thing that's really important is that under the PUD-5, even if these buildings were not landmarked, they would still go to the Landmark Preservation Commission for review, who would look at them with their landmarking and historic background. Look, for example, at the Town Hall Historic District and the fire station that's across the street from Town Hall. That's a new building in a historic district, but it was approved at a very rigorous process by the Landmark Commission. And we got a better product than the police station that's just north of it that wasn't reviewed at Landmarks. So I think Landmarks is a good vehicle to look at anything that happens on this 5-acre plot.
Can I ask a follow-up on that question?
I'll tell you, sure, why don't we get, all right, while Jane's talking.
Same question. Jane, I think Royal Poinciana Plaza is landmark.
Yes,
Can you do the same thing with the whole block here?
it is possible to do that. It is possible. It is possible to landmark this block. There is an ordinance, Chapter 54 of the Town of Palm Beach Code of Ordinances. The thing that's important to do is we can't landmark something just on nostalgia. It has to meet the criteria within that ordinance. We have one of the strongest ordinances in the state of Florida because it was enacted in 1979 before the Burt Harris legislation was put into place. And so that every property owner deserves their property to be adequately studied, then reviewed by the Landmark Commission and heard in a public hearing. Sometimes owners go along with the landmarking, sometimes they do not. The town council is the final decision makers to go ahead and landmark things. Part of my time in the town of Palm Beach, the town council asked me not to bring anything forward that did not have owner consent. The pendulum swings on that, but eventually it comes down to will the town council ratify or not what recommendations they get from the Landmark Commission, and I have great I believe in what Landmarks does and the people that are on that commission. Over the years, they've done a great job for the town.
There was a question at the last stop before we moved on that I want to just repeat and answer. The question was, what happens if to that particular property, the gas station, if in fact the PUD-5 is not approved? And it's a good question. The current CTS zoning, the Testa property as a whole, which the gas station is obviously part of, the Testa property as a whole is 1.32 acres. Under the existing CTS zoning, with 1.3 acres, it's the density, the residential density is allowed is 6 units per acre under CTS. So what you could end up with there is 8 residential units, 6 per acre times 1.32. So you can end up with 8 residential units. You can end up with a substantial amount of retail, probably in the space that we were standing on the first floor. Under both CTS and PUD-5, you can't have residential on the first floor. So any residential would have to be on the second or third floor. And that would have to be retail. One of the big differences, I think, on that property between CTS and PUD-5 is the fact that we don't require, under PUD-5, parking for the first floor retail. The space we were standing on is 125 feet by 100 feet. That's 12,500 square feet. If you had 10,000 square feet of retail there, you'd have to have 50 parking spaces, 50 on-site parking spaces. What you see here on the street doesn't count. So then if they put a new restaurant, if they tore this down under CTS, which their initial proposal to us was to tear it down, they would not be able to tear down the restaurant under at least the front 2 rooms of the restaurant under PUD-5. if they tore down the restaurant, they'd have to provide new parking for the new restaurant. The calculation of parking for restaurants in the code is 1 parking space for every 3 seats, and then there's an additional formula for the square footage in the kitchen. The parking requirements for residential under CTS are 2 spaces for each unit, and when you get to 5, you have to add an additional. So 8 residential units would be 16 plus 1, 17 parking spaces required. Same number of parking spaces generally required for PUD-5, and I'll explain the one exception in a little while. So you start to get the picture of 50 parking spaces plus probably 50 or 60 or 70 depending on the size of the restaurant, 16 for 16 for whatever residences they put, 17 actually. You're going to end up with a lot of parking under CTS on that property, a lot of parking. You're still going to have some parking under the PUD-5, possibly surface parking, possibly underground, but you're still going to have a lot of parking under CTS. Now let me talk a little bit about what we've got here. From here on down to the corner are all in the highest category of historically and architecturally contributing buildings. Under PUD-5, these buildings cannot come down. They would hopefully be renovated, and the John Vogt building that you see on the corner, the Art Deco building that wraps around all the way to Sunset. Jane, why don't you talk a little bit about these buildings? I've just given the zoning category, but you can give some further depth to the architecture.
One of the things that I love about this street, and one of the reasons that I am supporting the PUD-5, is I think it's the best chance that the town has to save what the town likes on the street. The contributing building report that I wrote in collaboration with the PUD-5 committee was passed unanimously in that meeting. So that where the people that are for the ordinance and against the ordinance seem to have overlap is in the realm of historic preservation. That's an important step forward from when I came to work in the town in 1992. The building in front of us, that's the Palm Beach Bookstore, was built about 1921. It was an auction house for a time. There was a movie theater in there. There was a very large awning over the front of the building. And it's something that, although we do not have an architect that we know of at this point because in-depth study hasn't been done, we do have a good neoclassical revival building, so architecturally it is something that perhaps could be landmarked. The building next to it, that's Nick and Johnny's, was designed by William Manley King. He was the school board architect for Palm Beach County in the 1920s. That building is 1927. Look closely at the details on the arches and the columns underneath the awning because they truly are remarkable for their time period in the 1920s. Palm Beach has landmarked other things by William Manley King. So for that building, I've got good architecture and I've got a well-known and already recognized architect. The building on the corner used to be a Mediterranean Revival style building, but in 1941, when South County Road was widened, the portico that people walked under had to be removed and John Volk was hired to do a renovation on this building. So he put the Art Deco details on it. It meets what we have in the design guidelines for the PUD-5 that says that the corner buildings should interact with their intersections. And it's also a building that has a well-known architect who is on the National Register of Historic Places and is a good example of the Art Deco style. So these are some of the top buildings on the street.
Okay. Unless there are any questions, I think we'll probably move on through the Testa Via right over here, back onto Sunset, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the properties back on Sunset. I wanted to stop here just for a second. The building that we're standing between, this building and this building, are both in the architecturally contributing category. That means they can't be torn down. They would have to. Jane could talk a little bit about the buildings if you have any questions on it, but these buildings would have to remain. Obviously, it can be renovated, the via can be renovated. So you start to get the picture of the Testa property. If it's developed under CTS, I believe the entire 1.32 acres would likely be torn down. That was their initial proposal. Under PUD-5, this building, and the front 2 rooms of the restaurant would remain. They would have to work around that. And as you walk by here and we go down Sunset, you know, take a look to your left and you'll see the back of the kitchen. That does not have to be preserved. And we wanted to make sure that something like that didn't get wrapped up in preservation, but the front two rooms of the restaurant, the upstairs terrace, ironically, the neon sign, which we now prohibit neon signs in our code, but they would have to preserve the neon sign. You know, that is part of the character of the street, and that would have to be saved. And so you're going to get a lot more preservation on this property than I believe you would under CTS. I think under CTS you're going to essentially see a parking lot back here. And you may see a parking lot back here under PUD-5, depending on whether they put parking underground, but it would be a smaller parking lot because you wouldn't have to provide any parking for any first floor retail. There was also a question while we were walking through the via about underground parking, and this is probably a good spot to mention that. The way the PUD-5 works on density is, as I said earlier, CTS is 6 units per acre. PUD-5 allows you to go to 10 units per acre. It also has a provision that says you can go to 13 units per acre in 2 cases. One of which is if you have underground parking, and that is if you put all of your parking underground. As a practical matter, I think the Testa property is probably the only property on the block that has enough space and enough elevation to put underground parking. And the theory there is we want to get the cars out of sight. We also have a provision in the PUD-5 that says 30% of the property has to be public open space. Well, public open space, this whole property owned by Testa is 52,000 square feet. 30% of that's about 15,000 square feet, 3/4 of an acre of public open space. The vision, obviously, and we hope if this ever happens and they develop it that way, they'll get a good architect who sees this, but the vision is 15,000 square feet of open space, pedestrian-friendly courtyard connecting through here and back and around. So you really have a very pedestrian-friendly space. And parking spaces, parking lots do not count under PUD-5 as your public open space. It's got to be space where people can walk on and congregate. And whatever space you decide to put for surface parking is not going to count towards your 30%. So we're going to walk down here, take a look at the back of the restaurant, and I'm going to walk a good distance, and then we're going to come back to the parking lot. Jane, do you want to add a couple things?
I do.
Yeah. Let me ask Jane to just supplement what I've said here.
I leave it to Mike to talk about the parking and the code issues, but what I've been trying to pay attention to are questions that have to do with historic preservation, because that's my main goal with all of this. And there has been questions in the press and in letters, and I've heard people say it publicly, that they're concerned that buildings that are listed as urbanistically contributing might only have their front facades protected, and what happens with those kind of buildings. Well, I want you to look across the street at the temple that's across the street. Only the front facades of that building are landmarked, but the Landmark Commission has worked with the temple to build a facility that's useful for them and still saves what can be seen by the public and is a good preservation of the architectural style in that building. It's also true that the First National Bank on County Road, all that's designated on those buildings, which are fabulous buildings, are the first 15 feet of the front facades. So there are 28 buildings in town that have only front or partial designations. So Landmarks knows how to deal with that. So I don't see that working with urbanistically contributing buildings in this block will be a problem for the Landmarks Commission.
Rachel?
I'm just wondering because some of these vias that we just walked through are maybe 8 or 9 feet wide, and my understanding, and I wish you'd correct me if I was wrong, is that in the PUD, aside from if you actually made a courtyard, that some of those walkways could be as narrow as 3 feet.
Well, there's no, the question was, can you have walkways as narrow as 3 feet? There's no upper or lower limit on the vias, and the reason there isn't is Stephen Mouzon said we shouldn't do that. We talked about putting a 12-foot requirement, but as you point out, this is probably less than 12 feet. So we really decided to leave that. Now, could it be 3 feet? Theoretically, sure. Would it pass landmarks, the town council, the planning and zoning commission, the 3 hoops you have to get through? I can't imagine that it would. But ultimately, we had to leave some things to the architects. And the width, some places, Steve Mouzon said a 4 or 5 foot via makes sense. Some spaces you need 12 or 15 feet. So we left that issue to the architects. Let's move on down the street. I wanted to stop here. We're going to go back to the parking lot in a minute behind the bank building, but I wanted to stop here for 2 reasons. The building that immediately in front of us here is an Art Deco building. It's designated as architecturally contributing. It can't be torn down. So under PUD-5 it would have to be preserved. And also, if you look at the location of the building next to the parking lot, over here next to a non-contributing building and then a parking lot, it also frankly serves as a buffer. One of the things that we put in the PUD-5 is you can't have PUD-5 development of more than 1.5 acres. So you can't get huge massing of properties to make some sort of city place-like development. There's no such protection in the CTS zoning. But also because of the way you've got architecturally contributing buildings dispersed throughout the street, or the block rather, that's a further check, in my opinion, on any type of massive development. If someone were to buy up the bank and they can't put the tested property and the bank together because that'd be more than 1.5 acres, but if they bought up the bank and this building over here, whatever they do, they're going to have to preserve this building in its entirety. Plus, it's 12 condominium units, and that's another factor why it's not going to get torn down. So this building has to be preserved. Now, if you look at the next building over, the Bonner Medical Office, this is actually the only building in this entire 5-acre block that was constructed since the adoption of CTS zoning in 1980. The bank is very similar to CTS zoning, but it was adopted and built in the mid-1970s. This building over here, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions about the architecture or anything, it's a nice building, but if you go look at this building, the entire first floor is a parking lot. The building is on stilts. Why is that? That's because they're trying to meet, so they're a small medical office on the second floor, they're trying to meet the CTS zoning parking requirements. And that is the fear that I have if we don't do something with this Florida, the parking requirements. And, they did a nice job with what they've got, but let's face it, the first floor is a parking garage and it's a building on stilts.
Michael, can I ask a question?
Sure.
On the parking, which you've mentioned several times now, was there no way to amend the CTS zoning to make the parking less onerous than it is?
The question was whether CTS zoning could have been amended to make parking less onerous. First of all, CTS zoning is not just in this 5-acre block. So it continues on northward from here. There are other areas in town as well. Certainly that's something that could be looked at, and if obviously I hope the PUD-5 passes by the voters, but if it doesn't, I certainly hope that that's something we look at. But then you don't have the preservation components and other components as well of the PUD-5. But parking is a pretty significant requirement here. Rachel.
Well, I'm wondering if you can tell us why you think there might have been an onerous parking requirement, 1, and 2, if you could answer if people ever get variances on the parking requirements.
Well, I know the answer, I think, to both questions. The first question was why. I think there was an attempt to limit development. And in 1980, I think the view was this would be a good check on development. The problem is nothing's happened here other than one building in the last 34 years since the CTS zoning was adopted. And you haven't seen a lot of money spent on this street. So, I think that was the vision. How well it's worked, I'm not so sure. And the question is variances. Have variances been granted? Yes, they have. Do I believe variances are lawful and would uphold a court challenge on a new construction? No. I don't think they would have a chance.
But aren't they granted with regularity in this
They are
town?
granted with some regularity, but not uniformly. And frankly, when you're talking with new construction, I don't see how you meet the requirement for a variance. For new construction under CTS zoning, you have to have essentially a problem that cannot be corrected with the land. And sure, maybe the council would pass it, but if anyone challenged it, either a competitor, a competing developer, a neighbor, possibly even any town resident, I don't think it would have a chance of holding up in court. I mean, one of the arguments I've seen is, oh, you'll just go get a variance for the parking. When you're doing new construction, getting a variance is legally very hard to do. Yes, the council grants a lot of variances, but we do draw the line, and variances that cannot be supported and cannot be upheld in court, I certainly don't vote for.
What if you're doing a renovation, which is the point is preserving these buildings and you're trying to do a renovation?
Maybe, but you know, you essentially, some of the properties we're going to be looking at could have no parking at all. Let's move in that direction. Let's go to the parking lot. The question was about 43 feet. You know, could you have a lot of that? First of all, you couldn't have it there. You couldn't have it on contributing buildings that can't be torn down. 43 feet is the top of the roof. The actual building itself would have to be 35 feet, which is the same as our code everywhere for 3-story buildings. And then you could either have 5 feet for a flat roof or 8 feet for a pitched roof. So that's how you get to 43. But Jane, you've looked at some other properties around, and maybe you could share that with us.
I think everybody's mixed-use commercial residential districts in the town of Palm Beach are on Worth Avenue, and they're via Meisner and via Parigi, both of which are locally landmarked and on the National Register of Historic Places. I talked to some of the architects that recently did a renovation on the Meisner apartment that faces Worth Avenue. It is 67 feet tall. The other tower that's in there that's a residential unit is 70 feet tall. Addison Meisner wouldn't have been able to build those lovely spaces if he had been restricted on height. The key is to make your height smaller and in scale with what the rest of the building is on the streets, the vias, and the pedestrian walkways. Again, I'll reiterate, Landmarks has experience in working with these things, but I don't think height is your enemy. I think the poor architecture is your enemy.
Thanks. Thanks, Jane. Let me talk a little bit about this property, because this is an interesting property. This is one of the few properties that complies with CTS zoning on the street. You've got half an acre between this parcel here, which is 100 feet, and that parcel up in the front. And if you look, you'll see they don't actually align up. They were sort of patched together over time. But on this half acre, you've got a 1-story office building that's got 2,800 square feet. That's 14% of the lot coverage. The rest of the 86% of the lot coverage, you can see it. It's got some green space, but primarily it's basically a parking lot and drive aisles. And the 15 parking spaces that you see here complies with the requirement of CTS zoning, because it's got enough parking. So again, this is something that could be built under CTS zoning. And the thing that I find somewhat objectionable is the drive aisles. You know, in a pedestrian-friendly Main Street, having an automobile drive across the sidewalk is not really that welcoming. In fact, when I was coming this morning for the tour, I saw something I hadn't seen before. There's a truck came right through there and just came down, took a left turn, and went on that way. He didn't park or anything. He just used this as a street. You know, one of the things that we do under the PUD-5 is we prohibit curb cuts on Royal Ponciano Way, Bradley Place, or County Road. The only place you can have a curb cut is on Sunset. And the idea is we want to prevent the curb cuts, the automobiles driving across the sidewalk when people are trying to walk on the sidewalk. And if you look, you see going out there, they've got a big sign, watch for pedestrians, and so on. Let me talk a minute about the density issue on this property. If this property were sold and raised and redeveloped under CTS zoning, they've got half an acre, they could put 3 residential units here. Whatever retail they put, they'd obviously have to provide parking, so you'd see a lot of parking. Under PUD-5, they could go to 10 residential units per acre, which are a total of 5 for half an acre, so you could pick up 2. Because of the alignment of the lots, I don't see how they could put underground parking here. I think it'd be engineeringly difficult, and also you're in a lower spot here. So you could see a couple more residential units here under PUD-5 than under CTS zoning. But as we go and we look at some of the properties, the older properties on the street that we're going to see in a minute, you're going to see that could be offset by some of the density reduction provisions. And I referenced a few minutes ago when I said you could get to 13 units per acre 2 ways. One is to put your parking underground. The other is if you bring your density down to 13 units per acre. And there's some pretty high density here. This building is the highest density on the block. It's 12 units on 1.35 acres. It's 88 units per acre density. The property up there, which we're going to take a look at in a minute, was designed by Gus Moss in 1945. That property has 8 residential units on 1/8 of an acre. It's 64 units per acre density. We're going to look at Les Evans's property, which has got 7 units on 1/5 of an acre. It's about 38 units per acre. So, for example, this property here, if they went from 8 units to 2 units and kept the entire first floor as retail, there's some residential in the back here on the first floor, and that could be converted to retail with no additional parking required. Then they went from 8 to 2, that would get them under 13 units per acre. They would not have to provide parking for those 2 units. I wanted to stop at this building because, as I said, I think this is a building that's got a lot of interesting prospects under PUD-5. It's got 8 residential units now. You can see the window units up on the top here. You can see the 8 mailboxes. You know, this building was designed by Gus Moss in 1945. Jane, I've already got your lines down. I'm sorry. And you know, it's got a beautiful courtyard where you could use some nice open space. You could have retail on the first floor in the back, and maybe convert what's up top to 2 residential units. This is a building where I see not a lot of hope under CTS. It's got no access to Sunset, and if you did have to have parking, there's no place to put it. And there's no place to get it there other than off the street here. So, you know, it's really impossible. This is an example of building built in 1945, the zoning code that went into effect in 1980 that requires substantial parking. It really is in a position where ultimately, not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but ultimately I think you're going to lose this building under CTS. And the idea is under PUD-5, basically they could do everything they wanted on the first floor on retail, convert those 8 units to 2 on residential, and renovate the building substantially and put it to a better use and have it hopefully last for a lot longer. It's, you know, it's not in the best of shape, but it's got a lot of potential, and I think it's a great old building. This is one of the 2 properties that I think that you could see substantial reductions in density and substantial renovations, and more importantly than all, preservation of a building that I don't see how it's going to last under CTS. Let's move down the street a bit. I'll just say a few words about the bank building. That's non-contributing. It could be torn down. I think there are a lot of people who would like to see it torn down. You know, and you look at this building, and it's not a bad building. It's not in poor shape. But it just, with those drive aisles and the sort of, it's Mediterranean revival architecture, but you look at that building and it could be anywhere. And that's why Jane and Steve Mouzon looked at it and really came to the conclusion this is a non-contributing building. And we wouldn't mind seeing it replaced with something that really fits more with the character of the street and get rid of those drive aisles. Jane, you want to add anything?
I want to talk about design guidelines that Stephen Mouzon worked with the committee to develop. And I want you to look again at the Gustav Moss building behind you, because a couple of points that he mentions in the design guidelines are things that we should emphasize. The 60% of the glass on the front store and the recessed entryways in the center invite pedestrians into a retail space. That's something that's very important in his design guideline. The other thing that he likes is the band between the first and second floor. If you step out a little, you can see it, but it's a good place to do identification of the building or the businesses that are there, and those are also things that are encouraged in the design guideline. So these are the kind of things that the PUD-5 looked at in the broader picture rather than just the zoning particulars.
What was the question?
I said, in the bank area, is that going to be 43 feet?
The bank
tall?
building could be replaced with something that at the very top goes to 43 feet.
Now, do you have restaurants and bars and things above the first story
No.
level?
No.
Two-story bars and restaurants.
Under CTS. No, under CTS. The question is, can you have this notion that you can have 2-story bars under PUD-5 and not under CTS is nonsense. I mean, you can have a bar, the code is the same on a bar and a restaurant under CTS. They are both permitted use. There is no restriction under CTS. If somebody was crazy enough to put a 2nd-story bar, they could do it today. They could do it to this building. I mean, you have to provide parking, but you can do a two-story, and if they tore that down, they could put a two-story bar under CTS. And this notion that you can get a second-story bar under PUD-5 where you can't under CTS is utter nonsense, because the code is the same for both of them.
Let me tell you a little bit about what's here. As I said, there's 4 residential units on the second floor. There's 3 on the first floor. They start right behind Rapunzel's. There's nothing behind the shop over there. It's basically vacant space. This is a property that could very easily be developed under PUD-5 with a courtyard, center courtyard behind Rapunzel's that goes all the way to the back of the property, and retail coming in from either side. They could put a second story somewhere in the back on that building on the far east side of the property. You essentially could go from 7 residential units to 2. You'd have a reduction of 5. By the way, this little via is unlocked, it's open, and I would encourage everyone to take a stroll back there and take a look around. And you can walk all the way back, you'll see some residential units, you'll see some space, and it should be open.
The thing that's most interesting about this building is how it's changed over time, as so many of the buildings in town have. If you look up where it says Peterbrook Chocolatier, above that there used to be a second window, and you can see that outlined in the stucco above. Again, the design guidelines encourage the plate glass windows at a pedestrian level. On Rapunzel's, they like a window that stops at the knee line. That's a buffer for dirt and things getting into the shop, and it's one of the things that's encouraged in the design guidelines. While I have the microphone, I'll talk about Main Street News for a minute. Architecturally and historically, because that may be one of the oldest buildings on the street. There are some references that say it dates back to Flagler's time. The problem from an architectural preservation point of view is the building has been so altered over time, you could make an argument that it no longer has its architectural integrity. The balcony and the wrought iron railings were all added to this building in the 1970s, as were the sliding glass doors above. All of those things we would like to be fixed under any renovation that happened. But if you look at the ceramic roundel at the top of the Madonna and Child, that's probably Meisner Industries. So it's something that Addison Meisner fabricated in the 1920s and sold them, and they are on a lot of different residential buildings all over town, but I don't know very many of them on commercial buildings.
The question was, what does CTS stand for? It stands for Commercial Town Serving. It was enacted in March of 1980, and it applies from Royal Ponce Way north to the north side of Sunrise Avenue. There's some of it on County Road. There's probably some others that I can't think of right now, but that's Commercial Town Serving. And it's essentially been a mixed use, but predominantly commercial zoning category. But this has been, there are 33 residential units on this 5-acre block now, and there have been a number of residential units, some more even during periods of time. In fact, a lot of Sunset, for those of us who've been around for more years than we can count, remember there was a lot of residential on Sunset back in the old days. In fact, that Foursquare animal hospital is an old residence that was turned into an animal hospital. I don't know. That's the Bradley House over there. It's landmark. It's got to be 43 feet or more because it's 4 stories plus that stuff on top. Anyway.
This is the Breakers parking lot here. This property is owned by the Breakers. The front of that building is urbanistically contributing. But there's a provision in the about this parking lot in the
PUD-5, which is important, and it really is designed for parking lots only. And this is currently the only parking lot on the street. There could conceivably be others. For example, if the gas station were torn down and turned into a parking lot. If you walk the street at night, you know that there's a dead space here, because there's a parking lot, and it's just dead. And there's life down there, it sprinkles, and there's life up there, and there's just darkness here. Jane and I worked with Steve Mouzon and the members of our committee to try and come up with something to deal with that. And what we came up with is
a provision in the PUD-5 that says if you have a parking lot on Royal Ponciano Way and you get rid of your curb cut, you can put one-story sidewalk fronting retail, provided you put 30% of that parking lot aside for public open space. So what that would mean in the context of this property is you'd probably have a via going through here and a via in back here, and you have first floor retail here. So when you walk by at night, there's light. There's something to look at other than a hedge and a dark space. And the PUD-5 also has provisions that new architecture has to be conforming and fit in with the existing architecture. So some of the things that Jane talked about on Rapunzel and the Gus Moss building in terms of what those storefronts would look like would have to be replicated in any type of new first floor retail. It could only be first floor, could not be second story. They wouldn't have any parking for second story. But the idea is you'd get rid of this parking lot. You'd get, this is approximately 105 by 60, so you've got about 6,500 square feet here. You'd be able to put approximately 4,000 square feet of retail and a little over 2,000 square feet of some type of via back here, which would be an improvement in our view. Jane, you want to touch on a few more points?
I'd like to.
Me?
Yeah. A lot of the people here,
A lot of the people in the group are asking me as an aside, how tall and where can those third stories be in any of the buildings as we designated them in the contributing building report, and I think you can do that faster than I can.
Well, on Royal Ponciano Way, the only buildings that can go to 3 stories are non-contributing buildings, and the only non-contributing buildings you have are the bank and the gas station. So those are the only properties that could go to 35 feet for the base of the building, and then 5 or 8 feet for the roof to get you to 43 feet. So those are the only buildings. Some instances here, no. Here you can't do it because this is a contributing building.
Oh, sorry.
And plus, you can't have, the other reason why you can't do it too, even in addition to that, is you can't, we've got a provision for retail first floor here that exempts you from parking. But anything else that goes on this site is going to have parking. And you can't have a curb cut. We prohibit curb cuts under PUD-5. And that's another way that you essentially prevent development, because there's some things you still have to have parking for under PUD-5. Unless you're reducing your density to 13 units, or you've essentially got to have parking for anything on the second floor, commercial or residential, and you can't get a curb cut. So the parking limitations are still in place, but they are relaxed significantly for first floor retail only. And the curb cut prohibition actually is going to be a further check on anything above the first floor. The question was, Jane, that you were talking about is the 43 feet. On Sunset, you could have some more buildings that could potentially go to 3 stories on Sunset. Obviously, whatever is put there is going to have to be approved by the Architectural Commission, the Landmarks Commission, the Planning and Zoning Commission, and the Town Council. You've got bookends of the block with 4 stories. Here, then if you cross County Road, there's a tall building. I don't know if it's 3 or 4 stories on the other side of County Road. There are a few parking lots back there, and those parking lots could conceivably have 2 or possibly in some instances 3 stories. So you could see that on some of those buildings on Sunset. There are not that many parking lots though, and I think one of the questions that we've struggled with in the Royal Ponciano Way Committee is, do we want Sunset to become one big parking lot? And you've already got a big parking lot there with Publix, and you could end up with a great deal of parking there if you see the rest of this block developed under PUD-5. So some people really think 43 stories, I guess, is a really bad thing. 43 feet is a really, well, I'm getting tired, you can tell. It's a hot day and I'm tired. But anyway, 43 feet is a bad thing, but parking lots too. I think a lot of folks feel that we don't want to see that street just become one big parking lot. A couple other questions. Someone mentioned precedent for other areas of town. This just relates to this 5-acre area.
It does not relate to Royal Ponciano Plaza. It does not relate to County Road. And I know the arguments have been made, well, someone's going to try and do the same thing. The PUD-5 has gone through 2 years of process now. We had committee meetings that went on for a year. We had 57 hours of meetings of the Royal Ponciano Way Committee. And we've now had to go through the Town Council, the Planning and Zoning Commission, back to the Town Council. You know, that's a very arduous process. And I think the notion that someone would walk in and say, we want to do this on the plaza, or which is landmarked, by the way, or portions of County Road where there's significant landmarked properties and landmarked facades, I just don't think that there's a very severe likelihood of that happening. I think we all recognize that Royal Ponciano Way is a unique part of town. It's got a long history. These buildings date back to the teens, as Jane said, and this is a special area. It's a special situation, and I would certainly argue, if I'm sitting on the dais, that this is not a precedent for other parts of town. That really concludes our tour. I'll take a couple of questions, and then I'm concerned about your parking, so I'm going to try and get you out of here. Over there.
Thank you. I guess my question is really this. My inclination has always been to support your work and opinions of the Preservation Foundation and others who are in support of the PUD-5. But what really I don't understand is why, and it seems as though it's been a very, very thoughtful process. I don't think anybody can deny that. But why has it been so difficult to get the message across clearly and have the opponents of PUD-5 in advertisements in the shiny sheet make it seem as though you're engaged in some sort of terrorist attack?
Did everyone hear that question? Good. I don't want to have to try and paraphrase that one. Look, you know, as I said in my letter that I sent to people, at this point in the tour, the question I usually get is, why is this so controversial? It's been a very thoughtful process. I don't think it's a particularly radical concept. It's an option. Current CTS stays in place. It has to legally. Our town attorney has told us you have to do it that way because of the Burt Harris Act. I don't think this should be so controversial. There's no grand scheme here. There's no grand agenda. The idea, you know, Jane Day is up here, by the way, on her own time. She's a volunteer. She drove up. She had a problem at her house this morning. She had to turn around, go back, drive back up. This is, you know, she's done this tour before. She spent countless hours as a volunteer because she believes in this. I can't tell you how many hours I've spent on this thing because I believe in it. I've lived in this town for 60 years, and I think the street needs something, and I think this is a solution to it. So I know some of the attacks have been really aggressive, shall we say. I think some of them have been misleading and inaccurate, but you know, what I've tried to do is lay out what you can do, what you can't do, lay out what we saw as the problems as we've grappled with this for over a year, to try and come up with solutions. And frankly, this is not my handiwork alone. There were 6 other people on that committee that came up with a lot of good suggestions and a lot of good ideas. You know, there's a lot of good representation there, and you know, is it perfect? Probably not. And by the way, it will sunset in 5 years as well. So because everything we do now in town, because of Burt Harris, sunsets whenever we change zoning. So if it doesn't work, it can get tossed out in 5 years, and it can be replaced by something else or modified. Right there.
Does the PUD go by land or by owner?
Does it go by land or by owner is the question. Good question. It goes by the property. It goes by the land. So and there's another provision too, by the way, which I haven't talked about, but really we spent a lot of time on your presentation. There's a provision there that says, you know, if you've got, under CTS, you could, for example, tear down this building, which is historically and architecturally contributing, can't be touched under PUD-5. Suppose you wanted to develop under PUD-5, but you didn't want to preserve the building. So you said, okay, I'll tear it down, then I'll apply. Well, we thought about that, and frankly, Susan was very helpful in that regard. We said, look, if you tear a building down, you can't develop under PUD-5 for 5 years. So you can't get around it that way. But it goes by land.
Michael, using this as an example, could you tell us, have you consulted with some of the owners? Are they in favor of some of the possible schemes you've talked about?
Good question.
So we can look forward to
Right.
some change?
Les Evans has said he will develop his property.
Les Evans.
That's the property where Rapunzel's is.
Oh, Rapunzel.
That
Okay.
storefront.
Yeah.
I've talked to Paul Leone. I've told him we were doing this. You know, the breakers plans years in advance, and I don't know whether they'll take advantage of this or not.
So,
Test is something's going to happen there, whether PUD-5 passes or not. Something's going to happen there. I mean, the law. You know, that gas station is I think appraised at $1.7 million alone. That property just can't sit there forever. Something's going to happen, and they've been pretty quiet through this process, but they did go on record at the last council meeting to support it. You know, I think generally there is support from the property owners,
great, thank you.
but you know, I think they're waiting to see what happens Tuesday.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll give you one more question, and then we're done.
Can you explain why, in your initial conversations, and you had a conversation with Mayor Riley of Charleston and the city that is the most heavily visited and renovated and tourist friendly and beautiful, that when he spoke with your commission, he said, I tell my developers in our town who want to come and do things in a historic area, come to me with any plan, but height and density are off the table. And so why, with your commission, did you choose those two incentives that are giving away zoning control from the town council that represents the people of the town? You are our elected officials. So can you explain your thinking process as to how you decided to give away zoning incentives
Well,
to make it happen?
Ann, I'll answer your question this way. I heard Mayor Riley, because I invited him to speak to us by telephone. I have a different view on what Mayor Riley said and what's happened in Charleston. They have used height in Charleston. They have allowed a lot of redevelopment in Charleston, and they have had some density issues in Charleston. So, and I didn't see the ironclad rule that you're talking about from Mayor Riley. And I think if you look at Charleston and you talk to people, I've talked to folks from Charleston. You know, I think they've been very creative there in their preservation. But I don't think that what we've done is inconsistent with what Mayor Riley has done in Charleston or what he was saying to us. I want to thank everybody for coming. Everyone get out and vote. I hope we all vote yes, but if you don't, that's okay. At least you're voting and you're exercising your civic right and responsibility. Take care.